there comes a moment in every empath's life when silence becomes more powerful than explanation. A moment when they stop chasing validation, stop over-explaining their feelings, and stop trying to make everyone understand their heart. That is not weakness. That is awakening. The moment an empath stops explaining themselves, a deeper energy rises within them, the Sophia power. A wisdom-driven force built from pain, self-respect, emotional intelligence, and spiritual growth. If you are entering this phase, your life is about to change forever. Empaths spend a large part of their lives trying to make themselves understood. They speak with honesty, they explain with care, and they often go beyond what is necessary just to ensure no one misunderstands their intentions. At the core of this behavior is not insecurity, but compassion. They genuinely believe that if people just hear their full explanation, the conflict will disappear and harmony will return. So they keep talking, keep clarifying, keep defending their emotions, hoping that patience will eventually turn into understanding. But life slowly teaches them a difficult truth. Not everyone is willing to understand, even when the explanation is clear. Some people are committed to their own interpretation. Others only listen to respond, not to comprehend. And there are those who deliberately twist words to maintain control or avoid accountability. For an empath, this realization feels like emotional exhaustion because they have invested so much energy into being fair, gentle, and transparent. There comes a turning point where the empath begins to notice that explaining themselves does not always bring peace. Instead, it often leads to more confusion, more emotional, draining conversations, and more self-doubt. They start questioning whether they said too much or not enough, whether they should rephrase their words again, or whether they should try harder to be understood. This cycle becomes tiring because it places their self-worth in the hands of people who were never truly listening in the first place. When the shift begins, something powerful changes within them. They stop rushing to fill every silence with justification. They stop rewriting their truth to make it easier for others to accept. They begin to realize that their intentions do not lose value just because someone refuses to see them clearly. This awareness slowly builds a new kind of inner stability that does not depend on external validation. At this stage, the empath learns to observe instead of over-explain. They notice how certain conversations only drain them further. They begin to recognize when dialogue is no longer about understanding, but about control or ego. Instead of stepping deeper into those exchanges, they step back, not out of anger, but out of clarity. With time, they understand that peace is not found in being fully understood by everyone, but in no longer needing everyone to understand them. Their energy becomes more protected, their words become more intentional, and their presence becomes quieter but stronger. They no longer feel the urge to convince every person of their truth because they have finally started believing in it themselves. Before awakening, silence often feels uncomfortable for empaths. They associate quiet moments with unresolved tension, missed opportunities to clarify, or the fear that someone might misunderstand them permanently. So they fill the gaps with words. They explain again after the argument ends. They send extra messages to make sure their intention is clear. And they take conversations in their mind, looking for places where they could have been better understood. This constant mental and emotional activity creates exhaustion because the empath is always trying to repair something that may not be broken on their side. As the inner shift begins, silence starts to feel different. It is no longer something to fear or rush through. It becomes something they can observe without panic. They begin to realize that not every misunderstanding deserves a reaction, and not every emotional disturbance requires their immediate response. In fact, they start noticing that many situations settle naturally when they are not being continuously fed with explanations or defensive energy. This is where silence transforms into strength. Instead of reacting impulsively, the empath learns to pause. That pause is not emptiness, it is awareness. It allows them to see the true nature of the situation without being emotionally entangled in it. They begin to understand that words, when overused, lose their power, but silence, when used consciously, can communicate emotional maturity and inner control. In this stage, they stop chasing closure from people who are numb. T, offering understanding, they stop trying to fill every uncomfortable gap in communication. If someone misinterprets them, they no longer feel the urgent need to correct every detail. They begin to trust that truth does not require constant defense, and that genuine connections do not collapse because of a single quiet moment. Silence also becomes a form of protection. It shields them from unnecessary emotional drains, arguments that lead nowhere, and repetitive cycles of explaining the same intention to someone unwilling to receive it. Instead of draining themselves in endless conversations, they preserve their energy for spaces where mutual respect exists. Over time, this relationship with silence matures into something powerful. The empath no longer sees silence as absence, but as presence without noise. They begin to carry themselves with a calm confidence that does not depend on verbal validation. Even in tense situations, they no longer rush to fill every gap with words because they have learned that peace often grows in what is left unsaid. Empaths naturally carry a deep sensitivity to the emotions of others, often feeling them as if they were their own. For a long time, T, his ability makes them highly attentive, compassionate, and emotionally available. They notice subtle changes in tone, energy, and expression that others overlook. Because of this heightened awareness, they often step into roles where they try to help, fix, or soothe the emotional discomfort around them, even when it comes at the cost of their own inner stability. Over time, this constant emotional absorption begins to create an invisible weight. They walk into rooms and instantly feel the atmosphere. They engage in conversations and unconsciously take on the emotional burden of the other person. If someone is angry, they feel responsible. If someone is sad, they try to fix it. If someone is confused, they try to clarify everything for them. Slowly, their own emotional space becomes crowded with feelings that do not belong to them. The shift begins when they start recognizing that not every emotional experience around them is theirs to carry. They begin to see that empathy without boundaries turns into self-drain. They may still care deeply, but they stop merging their emotions with everyone else's emotional state. Instead of absorbing pain, they start observing it with awareness. B, instead of internalizing chaos, they learn to stand beside it without becoming part of it. This transformation is subtle but powerful. They begin to pause before reacting emotionally to other people's moods. They stop automatically trying to rescue everyone from discomfort. They realize that helping someone does not always mean carrying their emotional weight. In fact, true support sometimes requires distance, clarity, and emotional separation. As this awareness grows, they start setting invisible but firm boundaries. They become more selective about where their energy flows. They no longer engage in every emotional storm that surrounds them. If someone is projecting negativity, they do not immediately absorb it or try to neutralize it. Instead, they recognize it as something that belongs to that person's inner world, not theirs. This change brings a deep sense of relief. The empath begins to feel lighter, as if years of emotional accumulation are slowly being released. They rediscover parts of themselves that were previously buried under the weight of other people's feelings. Their energy becomes more stable, their mind becomes clearer, and their emotional responses become more re-intentional rather than automatic. Eventually, they understand that compassion does not require self-sacrifice. They can care without caring. They can love without absorbing. And they can remain open-hearted without becoming emotionally overwhelmed by everything around them. As the empath moves deeper into self-awareness, something remarkable begins to happen to their inner perception. Their intuition, which was always present but often overshadowed by emotional overwhelm and overthinking, starts to sharpen into a clear and reliable inner guidance system. Earlier in life, they might have doubted their instincts, second-guessed their feelings, or overridden their inner voice in favor of logic from others or the desire to keep peace. This created confusion where what they felt internally often clashed with what they were told externally. With time and emotional experience, especially after repeated situations of being misunderstood or emotionally drained, the empath begins to trust patterns instead of promises. They start noticing that their first instinct about people and situations is often accurate, even when they tried to ignore it. Subtle signals that once felt confusing become clearer. Tone, behavior, consistency, and energy all begin to form a language that they understand without needing explanation. This is where intuition becomes unstoppable. It is no longer a fragile feeling that needs validation. It becomes a strong internal compass that guides decisions, relationships, and boundaries. The empath no longer needs long discussions or excessive proof to sense when something feels right or wrong. They can walk into a situation and immediately feel its emotional direction. They can meet someone and sense whether the connection is genuine or draining. What makes this shift powerful is not just the accuracy of intuition, but the confidence that follows it. The empath stops abandoning their inner knowing just to maintain comfort or avoid conflict. They begin to act on what they sense even when it is difficult or unpopular. This reduces emotional confusion because they are no longer living in contradiction with themselves. They also become more observant and less reactive. Instead of being pulled into every emotional narrative, they step back and read the situation as a whole. They notice inconsistencies between words and actions. They recognize repeated behavioral patterns instead of being swayed by temporary emotions or apologies. This clarity protects them from cycles they once struggled to escape. As this intuitive strength grows, decision-making becomes simpler. They no longer need excessive reassurance from others before choosing a path. They learn to sit with their internal signals long enough to understand them, rather than rushing to seek external approval. Even in uncertainty, they develop a quiet trust in themselves that was previously missing. Eventually, intuition becomes not just a tool, but a form of inner authority. It guides their relationships, their boundaries, and their direction in life. And the more they honor it, the stronger it becomes, until ignoring it feels more painful than following it. There is a powerful stage in the empath's transformation where emotional exhaustion turns into emotional clarity, and that clarity begins to reshape how they relate to people who once drained them. In earlier phases of life, they may have held on tightly to relationships even when they were painful, believing that understanding, patience, or more effort could eventually fix what was broken. They tried to explain, to forgive repeatedly, and to keep connections alive even when their own emotional well-being was slowly being eroded. But as awareness deepens, something fundamental changes. They begin to realize that not every connection is meant to be repaired, and not every person is meant to stay. The need for emotional closure, validation, or explanation from others starts to lose its grip on them. Instead of demanding understanding, they begin to value peace. Instead of chasing conversations that go in circles, they start choosing distance. This is where detachment begins to form, not as coldness, but as clarity. They are no longer emotionally entangled in every situation that once triggered them. When misunderstandings happen, they do not rush to fix everything immediately. When people show inconsistency or emotional manipulation, they observe rather than react. They begin to see that staying in certain emotional environments comes at the cost of their inner stability. What makes this shift profound is that it does not come from anger. It comes from understanding. The empath does not detach because they stop caring. They detach because they finally understand how much unnecessary pain comes from overinvestment in the wrong places. They recognize that repeating the same emotional cycles only deepens exhaustion without creating real change. With this awareness, they begin to walk away from situations that no longer align with their emotional health. They stop over-explaining their departure. They stop seeking approval for their boundaries. Instead of trying to convince others why they are leaving, they simply leave. Their actions become quieter, more intentional, and more self-respecting. Even more importantly, they release the need for revenge or emotional retaliation. In earlier stages, hurt might have led to anger or the desire to be understood at all costs. But in this phase, they realize that carrying resentment only keeps them connected to what they are trying to leave behind. So they choose neutrality instead of conflict, peace instead of prolonged emotional battles. This form of detachment creates space for healing. Their emotional energy is no longer constantly tied to unresolved dynamics or draining relationships. They begin to feel lighter, more centered, and more in control of their internal world. What once felt like emotional chaos slowly transforms into emotional stability. Eventually, they understand that walking away is not loss, but protection. It is not rejection of others, but acceptance of self-worth. And in that realization, they find a strength that does not depend on explanation, approval, or emotional closure from anyone else. There is a final and deeply transformative stage in the empath's journey where everything begins to settle into a new internal truth. After all the explaining, overgiving, emotional exhaustion, and learning, something within them finally clicks into place. They begin to see themselves not through the lens of how others responded to them, but through the reality of who they have always been beneath all the noise. For so long, their sense of worth was indirectly shaped by reactions, approval, misunderstandings, and emotional exchanges. But now that external mirror starts to lose its power. At this stage, the empath begins to understand that their value was never something that needed to be proven. It was never dependent on being constantly understood, validated, or accepted by others. The realization slowly sinks in that they were already enough, even in moments when they were due, beating themselves, even in situations where they were misunderstood, and even in times when they were emotionally overwhelmed and searching for clarity outside of themselves. This awareness creates a profound shift in behavior. They no longer shrink themselves to fit into spaces that cannot hold their depth. They stop editing their personality to make others more comfortable. They no longer apologize for their sensitivity, their perception, or their emotional intelligence. Instead of questioning whether they are too much, they begin to recognize that they are simply not meant for environments that cannot handle authenticity. Their presence starts to change naturally. There is less urgency in their voice, less need to prove a point, and less emotional dependency on outcomes. They move through interactions with a quiet confidence that does not demand attention but naturally commands respect. They no longer chase validation because they have stopped outsourcing their worth. What makes this stage powerful is the internal stability it brings. External opinions, misunderstandings, or silence from others no longer shake their sense of identity. They are no longer easily pulled into emotional storms or self-doubt cycles triggered by others' reactions. Instead, they remain anchored in a deeper understanding of themselves. They also begin to choose themselves more consistently. This does not come from ego, but from self-respect. They choose environments that feel aligned, relationships that feel mutual, and experiences that do not require them to abandon their inner peace. If something demands constant emotional sacrifice, they no longer see it as worth keeping. Over time, this inner clarity becomes their foundation. They no longer live in reaction to others, they live in alignment with themselves. And in that alignment, they find a form of strength that is calm, steady, and unshakable. It is not loud, it does not seek approval, and it does not need justification. It simply exists as knowing. In this final realization, the empath no longer searches for worth in external reflection. They embody it. If you are in this season of life, do not fear the changes happening inside you. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming wise. You are not losing your kindness. You are learning balance, and you are not too sensitive. You are awakening to a higher level of emotional intelligence and self-respect. The moment an empath stops explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them, the Sophia power awakens. And once it awakens, nothing can control them again.